grease under my fingernails. That's what Walter Caldwell pointed at when he introduced me to his golf buddies at my daughter's rehearsal dinner. This is Frank. He fixes machines at the plant, blue collar all the way, but hey, somebody's got to keep the lights on for the rest of us. 40 people laughed. Not cruel laughter, exactly. I let it go. What none of them knew, not Walter, not his son Grant, not one soul in that country club dining room with their $40 steaks and their imported wine, is that 11 years ago, when Caldwell Furniture Group was 3 months from bankruptcy, I was the one who wired $2-3 million into a shell-holding company to buy out their collapsing senior debt. I don't just fix machines at that plant. I own 51% of it. And tomorrow, at my daughter's wedding, Walter Caldwell was about to find that out in front of everyone he'd ever tried to impress. Sometimes the man in the coveralls isn't the help. Sometimes he's the one who decides if you keep your name on the building. But before I tell you how that night ended, you need to understand how it started. Not the dinner, the 11 years before it. My name is Frank Delgado. Harold Caldwell hired me himself, actually, back in 1987, a detail most people at the company today don't know because it predates almost everyone else on the payroll. I was fresh out of a 2-year trade program, nervous, wearing a borrowed tie to an interview for a job that didn't require one. Harold ran that company for another 24 years after he hired me, and in all that time, I never once saw him treat a line worker as beneath his notice. He knew everyone's kids' names. He came to the hospital when my father had his first heart attack, sat with me in the waiting room for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon when he had every excuse in the world to send flowers instead and call it done. Walter inherited the company from a father who'd spent 40 years proving, through 1,000 small daily choices, that respect for the people who build a business isn't separate from good business. I started as a line mechanic. Fixed the belt sanders, kept the upholstery machines from jamming, learned every piece of equipment in that building by the sound it made when something was about to break. By the time I was 35, I'd worked my way up to plant maintenance supervisor. Rosa was my wife. I need you to understand her before anything else in the story makes sense, because everything that happened at that dinner, everything, traces back to her. I met Rosa Ibarra in 1988 at a laundromat 2 blocks from the plant. I was 23, folding work shirts that still smelled like machine grease no matter how many times I washed them. I married her 11 months later. Best decision of my life. No contest. Not close. Rosa had a gift for numbers that nobody ever gave her the chance to use professionally. She never went to college. Her family couldn't afford it. And by the time we were married, we were saving every spare dollar for a house, not tuition. But she read. I didn't understand at the time that she was teaching me a philosophy, not just a hobby. I thought we were just 2 working people trying to stretch a paycheck. We started small. A few shares of a mutual fund through my 401k at the plant, back before that was even standard for a company our size. Harold Caldwell was old-fashioned but fair, and he matched contributions dollar for dollar up to 4%, which was more generous than it sounds for a furniture manufacturer in a town like ours. By our 15th wedding anniversary, we'd built what Rosa called a quiet little portfolio. Not flashy, no yachts in our future, but real. 6 figures, then 7, invested conservatively, compounding the way patient money compounds when nobody's watching it and nobody's panicking over it. Rosa cried when the check came, not from relief, but from something closer to grief. She'd loved nursing, loved it the way I loved fixing machines, and she knew that part of her life was over. She never went back to the EQ. What she said to me the week the settlement came through, I still remember word for word. We were sitting at that same kitchen table, the check between us like something radioactive. Frank, we're not spending this on anything ordinary. Ordinary is a bigger house, a better car, a vacation we forget about in a year. We didn't know then that something would end up being the company that employed me. Life doesn't usually hand you the setup for its own punchline that neatly. He wanted Caldwell Furniture to be a national brand, wanted showrooms in 6 states, wanted a factory expansion that doubled our square footage, wanted the kind of growth that photographs well in a business magazine. He borrowed heavily to do it, took on senior debt against the company's real estate and equipment, expanded the plant, hired a national sales team, opened showrooms in markets we had no distribution infrastructure to support. The expansion coincided almost exactly with a downturn in the furniture retail sector as e-commerce started eating into brick-and-mortar sales. And by early 2015, Caldwell Furniture Group was 3 covenant violations away from the bank calling the entire loan due. I watched it happen from the floor. You'd be amazed what a maintenance supervisor sees and hears in a plant that size. I saw purchase orders slow down. I saw overtime get cut, then cut again. Frank, she finally said, how much of that senior debt do you think the bank would sell for if they thought the company was going under? I didn't understand the question at first. She had to explain it to me 3 times. You're talking about buying my job, I said. I'm talking about protecting your job, she said, and building something that matters longer than we're around to enjoy it. Isn't that what I told you 6 years ago? I want to slow down here because this part of the story is the part people skip past when they retell it later, and it's actually the most important part. Rosa found the lawyer, a woman named Priscilla Newby who specialized in distressed debt for small manufacturers, through one of those community finance seminars at the public library that I always assumed was just Rosa keeping her mind busy on Tuesday evenings while I worked overtime. I found out later she'd been attending those seminars for almost 6 years by the time Caldwell's crisis hit. 6 years of building relationships, learning terminology, understanding exactly how these deals worked in the real world. "You thought I was doing crossword puzzles with extra steps," she told me once, laughing. In the weeks after we'd first met Priscilla, "Frank, I was building a network. Every one of those seminar nights, I met somebody who knew somebody, a retired banker who explained loan covenants to me over coffee twice a month for a year, a small business owner 2 towns over who'd gone through a restructuring herself and walked me through every step of what went wrong and what went right. None of it looked like anything from the outside." Priscilla was skeptical of us at first, understandably. 2 people showing up with $400,000 from an injury settlement, wanting to buy distressed senior debt from a regional bank, is not a typical client profile for her practice. "She does medical records administration," I said. "But you're not wrong." We spent 3 weeks after that with Priscilla, working out the structure. She helped us set up a holding company. We approached the bank through the lawyer, never in our own names. Then, Rosewood restructured that debt directly with Caldwell Furniture Group's board. Walter, drowning and desperate, agreed to terms he probably wouldn't have accepted in a calmer moment, in exchange for forgiving a substantial portion of the debt and extending generous terms on the rest. Rosewood Capital received 51% of the company's equity. Walter never asked who ran Rosewood Capital. The lawyers who represented us in the negotiation were professional, discreet, and per our explicit instruction, never mentioned my name in connection with the deal. All Walter knew was that some private equity group had rescued his company from the brink and taken a controlling equity stake in exchange. He was so relieved to keep the company's doors open, so relieved to avoid the personal humiliation of presiding over his father's business going bankrupt, that he simply never asked the follow-up question that would have blown the whole thing open. Meanwhile, on the floor, I stayed exactly who I was. I fixed the presses. I trained new hires on the safety protocols. I let him believe it, partly for leverage. I won't pretend otherwise. Rosa and I both understood that anonymity gave Rosewood Capital more control, more ability to observe and correct problems without the political theater that would have erupted if Walter knew his controlling shareholder was pushing a mop cart 3 days a week. But partly, if I'm honest with myself and with you, I let him believe it because I wanted to see what kind of man he really was when he thought no one important was watching him. It's a strange kind of education, watching a man for over a decade who has no idea you hold his fate in your hands. I learned that he tipped the country club valet $20 in front of his golf buddies and stiffed the plant's overnight cleaning crew on their holiday bonus the same month. I learned that he'd cry actual tears at his father's memorial dinner every year, genuine grief, and then turn around 3 weeks later and cut health benefits for part-time line workers to hit a quarterly number. And Men Like Weeby was worse than evil, and he wasn't a cartoon villain. That's the thing people get wrong about men like Walter. He wasn't evil. He was worse than evil, in a way. He was that sightless, comfortable in a way. There were moments during those 11 years when I nearly told him, "You can," she said. Not because it's easy, but because the version of this story where you correct him in front of investors in 2017 is a smaller story than the version where you wait. In 2019, the same year Rosa died, Caldwell Furniture Group had its best fiscal year in over a decade. A fact I learned not from Walter directly but from the quarterly board packets that arrived, as they always did, addressed simply to R. Delgado, managing member, Rosewood Capital LCA, a name that meant nothing to the office manager who mailed them, and everything to the man who opened them alone in a kitchen that had gone quiet after decades of 2 voices in it. I remember sitting with that packet the week after decades of 2 voices in it. I remember sitting with that packet the week after Rosa's funeral, reading through the numbers with the same patient attention she'd built with me. Was the last project we'd ever complete together. I owed it to her to keep doing it right, even with her gone, even with her. Kayla, in the years after her mother's death, leaned on me more than she probably realized, and I leaned on the plant more than I probably admitted to anyone. Rosa died in 2019. I won't dwell too long on those 8 months here, because some things belong only to the people who lived through them. But I'll tell you this much, even sick, even exhausted from treatments that took more out of her than the cancer itself some weeks, Rosa kept working the numbers. Somewhere in the middle of those 8 months, on an afternoon when she was lucid and strong enough to sit up in the hospice bed we'd set up in our own living room rather than a sterile hospital room, she made me promise something. "Rosewood stays," she said. "Whatever else happens, Frank, you don't sell that stake, you don't cash out, you hold it and you watch, and someday when it matters, not before, but when it actually matters, you use it." I promised her. I didn't know yet what moment she meant. Kayla was 7 when Rosewood Capital, and she grew up almost entirely without knowing what her parents actually owned. She met Grant Caldwell at a charity 5K 2 years ago, one of those corporate wellness events Walter's company sponsored as a tax write-off and photo opportunity. Grant was 29 then, an operations analyst at his father's company, the kind of job title that sounds like real work, but mostly meant he sat in on meetings and occasionally offered opinions that carried more weight than his experience justified, purely because of his last name. He was charming in the specific way that men who've never had to work for anyone's approval are charming. Easy smile, good eye contact, the kind of attentiveness that feels like genuine interest until you notice it's the same attentiveness he gives everyone, a practiced social skill rather than actual curiosity. I want to be fair to Grant, even now, even after everything. In those early months, I genuinely believed there was a decent man somewhere underneath the polish, someone who might, with the right pressure and the right example, grow into someone worthy of my daughter. The cracks started showing about 8 months into their relationship, right around the time Kayla brought Grant to our house for the first time for a real family dinner. Not a quick hello and goodbye, but an actual sit-down meal. After he left that night, Kayla asked me what I thought of him. I told her the truth carefully, that he seemed nice, that I could see why she liked him, but that I hoped as things got more serious, he'd show a little more of himself. Because right now, I felt like I was watching a very good performance of a person, rather than the person himself. She got defensive. Of course she did. She was in love, and nobody wants to hear that kind of assessment about someone they're in love with. We didn't talk about Grant again for weeks after that. I noticed something else that day, something smaller, that stuck with me longer than the cross-functional comment. My nephew Matteo, 9 years old, spilled grape juice on Grant's shirt while running past the drinks table. The engagement year is when things got harder to ignore. Walter and his wife Diane took an increasingly active role in wedding planning, which mostly meant an increasingly active role in reshaping the wedding into something that reflected the Caldwell family standing, rather than anything Kayla and Grant had originally discussed. The venue changed from a modest garden space Kayla had loved to Riverside Country Club, a facility so far outside our normal world that I had to ask the valet for directions to guest parking the first time I visited to help with setup logistics. The disrespect accumulated slowly, the way water accumulates behind a dam you don't realize is close to breaking. At the engagement party, Diane introduced me to her book club friends as Kayla's father. He's very hands-on, works at the plant, very grounded. At a dress fitting I'd been invited to sit in on, Walter's sister asked me, with what she clearly thought was gracious curiosity, whether I'd ever get to see the finer side of things now that Kayla was marrying into the Caldwell family, as though my daughter's happiness was a door I'd be allowed to peek through rather than walk through as her father. Grant, to his credit or discredit, depending on how you look at it, rarely said anything overtly cruel to my face during that year. His cruelty was quieter, more structural, the assumption, never stated outright but obvious in 100 small choices, that my role in his and Kayla's future was peripheral. He never asked my opinion on anything about the wedding, never asked about my work beyond surface pleasantries. Once, at a dinner with both families, he made an offhand comment about how he hoped their kids someday would have real career options, not just whatever's available in a factory town, and didn't seem to register even for a second that he just described the only life I'd ever built, the life that had put braces on his fiance's teeth and paid for her college textbooks. And, there was a Sunday brunch maybe 3 months before the wedding, where Diane spent 20 minutes describing a family vacation the Caldwells had taken to Portugal, going into detail about a vineyard tour and a private chef, and then turned to me with what she clearly believed was inclusive warmth and asked, there was a moment at the final dress fitting, 6 weeks before the wedding, when the seamstress, a kind older woman named Bettina who'd been doing alterations in this town for longer than I'd been working at the plant, recognized me from a chair repair job I'd done for her shop 2 winters earlier, back when a delivery truck had backed into her display window frame and I'd come by after my regular shift to fix it as a favor, refusing payment because Bettina had always been kind to Rosa. I let all of it go. The rehearsal dinner, the night before the wedding, is where waiting finally ran out. And of course, we're thrilled to welcome the Delgado family into the fold, he said, raising his glass slightly toward Kayla and me. A few polite chuckles rippled through the room. 40 people laughed. Grant laughed loudest of anyone. I felt Kayla's hand find mine under the table, gripping hard enough to leave marks, her way of silently begging me not to make a scene at her rehearsal dinner. Dinner continued, salads, then the entree, some kind of herb-crusted salmon that I barely tasted because I was doing math in my head. Not angry math, not yet. Just the quiet accounting habit Rosa had trained into me over 30 years of marriage, the automatic instinct to track numbers even when my mind was elsewhere. 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, Rosewood Capital was required to file its annual equity disclosure with Caldwell Furniture Group's board, a routine document that would, for the first time in over a decade, actually name me directly as the managing member. Per updated compliance requirements our lawyer had flagged the previous month. I'd known that filing was coming. I'd planned to tell Walter privately before it happened, out of what remained of my respect for Kayla's future in-laws, to give him time to process it without an audience. I hadn't planned to tell him at the rehearsal dinner, but somewhere between the salmon and dessert, Grant leaned over toward me, still riding the high of his father's toast, and delivered the line that changed my plan entirely. No hard feelings, Frank, he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder with the casual condescension of a man giving a compliment he thinks is generous. Someone's got to grease the gears while the rest of us run the business, right? I set my fork down, not dramatically, just set it down, the way you set something down when you've decided you're finished with it. Actually, Walter, I said, my voice carrying just enough to draw attention from the nearby tables without shouting, I think it's time we talked about the business. Walter chuckled, already half-turned toward another conversation, the reflexive dismissal of a man who spent his whole life not needing to fully listen to people like me. It's exactly the night, I said, because in 6 weeks Rosewood Capital is required to file its annual disclosure with your board. And I'd rather you hear it from me first as family than read it cold in a filing your general counsel forwards you on a Tuesday morning. Rosewood Capital, he repeated slowly, turning fully toward me now. That's our equity partner from the restructuring. I let that sit for a second before I finished it. Are for Rosa, I said. I'm also your controlling shareholder, I said. Both are true, Grant. You just only ever bothered to learn one. Diane, Walter's wife, set her wineglass down with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Frank, I think there must be some kind of confusion. Our attorneys handle all of that. Your attorneys have mentioned it every quarter for 11 years, I said, in every packet Walter's signed for. Walter's face had gone the color of the tablecloth by now, a gray-white that made the flush of his earlier toast look like a fever breaking. You made this the venue an hour ago, I said, my voice even, controlled, the calm I'd been practicing for 11 years finally getting its use. You stood up in front of 200 people tomorrow's worth of guests and told a room full of your friends that I keep the lights on for the rest of you. Kayla's hand had gone rigid in mine. I glanced at her, and what I saw there wasn't anger at me. Not yet, not in that first moment, but a kind of vertigo, the look of someone whose entire understanding of her father had just cracked open in front of 200 witnesses. I felt for her more than I felt for anyone else at that table. But it was Grant who kept talking. Because Grant, I was learning even in that moment, had never developed the instinct to stop when he was ahead, or, in this case, badly behind. This is absurd, he said, louder now, some of his earlier confidence trying to reassert itself even as the ground shifted under him. I turned to Walter directly then, and something in my voice must have finally registered as entirely serious, because the table around us had gone fully silent, the string quartet in the corner faltering into an uncertain stop as they noticed the room's attention shift. You want to know why I never told you, Walter? Because for 11 years, I wanted to see what kind of man you were when you thought nobody with any power was watching. Walter's jaw worked, no sound coming out for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the smooth confidence from his toast. Frank, please, whatever's happened here. We were already business partners, I said. That part didn't require a wedding. The question now is whether we can also be family. And honestly, Walter, after tonight, I'm not sure that's up to me to decide alone anymore. I looked at Kayla then, and I softened my voice as much as I could manage while my hands were still shaking with 11 years of restraint finally breaking loose. She didn't say anything. I didn't try to explain further, not there, not in front of 200 people who were now openly staring, phones starting to appear at a few tables in that unmistakable way people reach for their phones when they sense something worth recording. I stood up, folded my napkin, and said the only thing that felt right in that moment. I think I should go. This is your night, Kayla, yours and Grant's, and I've turned it into something else. I'm sorry for that part, even if I'm not sorry for the truth itself. I looked at Walter one last time. We'll talk business on Monday like you suggested. Tonight was never supposed to be about the company. You made it about the company the moment you decided my daughter's father was a punchline. I walked out of that ballroom with every eye in the room on my back, and I want to tell you, it felt like triumph, the kind of clean, satisfying justice you see in movies. It didn't. It felt like grief, oddly. The days between the rehearsal dinner and the wedding itself were some of the strangest of my life. Walter called first, around 10 the next morning, his voice carefully controlled in that way executives learn to control their voices when they're managing a crisis rather than feeling one. He wanted to discuss the situation like reasonable men. I told him I was happy to discuss it, but that whatever we discussed wouldn't change the fact that his company's controlling shareholder had watched him disrespect his daughter's father for 11 years and had finally run out of patience. I never knew Frank, he said, and for the first time in 11 years of knowing him, I heard something in his voice that sounded like it might actually be genuine rather than performed. If you'd known, you'd have treated me differently, I said. That's exactly the problem, Walter. The measure of a man isn't how he treats people he knows might have power over him someday. It's how he treats people he's certain never will. You failed that measure for 11 years running. I just happened to be in a position to make the stakes visible. He didn't have a good response to that. Nobody ever does, in my experience, when you hand them back their own logic and ask them to sit with it. You humiliated my family in front of 200 people, he said. No preamble, no greeting. The night before our wedding, Frank, do you have any idea what you've done to Kayla? I know exactly what I did, I said, keeping my voice level even as my chest tightened at the mention of Kayla crying. I told the truth in response to being publicly mocked at my own daughter's rehearsal dinner. If you want to talk about who humiliated whom first, Grant, I'm happy to have that conversation. I should back up slightly, because I skipped over a few details of that dinner table conversation that matter to how the rest of the night unfolded, and I want to give you the full picture rather than just the headline moment. After I told Walter about the R for Rosa, a woman I didn't recognize, a ripple of nervous laughter went through the room at that. The kind of laughter people produce when they don't know whether laughing is appropriate, but feel a physical need to release tension somehow. I remember almost smiling despite everything, because the ghost fun was exactly the kind of thing Rosa would have found funny. She'd insisted on that level of anonymity specifically, refusing every request for meetings, conferences, or public profile, precisely so that a moment like this one could exist on our terms, rather than anyone else's. Grant's best man, a college roommate named Chip, who I'd met exactly twice before that night, made the mistake of trying to lighten the mood with a joke. Walter tried once more to move the conversation into private territory. You made this about the whole room, Walter, I said again, because it bore repeating. That's when Grant, who'd been quiet for almost a full minute, an eternity for him, found his voice again, and it came out sharper than anything he'd said to me in 2 years of knowing him. This is absurd, he said. If you actually controlled this company, we would know. My father would know. You don't get to hide something like that for 11 years and then spring it at a rehearsal dinner like some kind of stunt. I didn't spring anything, I said. I've been sitting on facts, Grant. There's a difference. A stunt is loud and it's designed to be seen. I planned to, I said. I had a private conversation scheduled in my head for some time after the wedding, once things had settled, once I found the right moment that wasn't going to overshadow Kayla's day. He hung up on me. Kayla finally called me 2 days later. Dad, she said, I need you to explain everything. Not the short version you gave at dinner, everything. So I told her. I told her about the laundromat where I met her mother. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked in a way that broke something in my chest. Why didn't you tell me, Dad? Not them, me. Why did I have to find out my own father owns the company my fiance's family runs, in the middle of a rehearsal dinner, in front of 200 strangers? It was the fairest question anyone had asked me in 11 years, and I didn't have a fully satisfying answer, only an honest one. Because your mother and I decided, a long time ago, that we didn't want money, or ownership, or any of it, to change how you grew up. We wanted you to work for your own things, to understand the value of what you earned rather than what you inherited. Do you hate him? She asked. Grant, do you hate him? She didn't say she forgave me that night. She didn't say she was still marrying Grant either. The morning of the wedding, I sat alone in my truck in the country club parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I hadn't slept much the night before, the second sleepless night in a row, on top of everything else, and I remember running through every version of how the day might unfold. None of that happened. But I want you to understand that I didn't know it wouldn't happen. Sitting in that parking lot with my hands on the wheel, still in my work boots because I hadn't trusted myself to put on dress shoes until I knew for certain there'd be a ceremony worth dressing for. Kayla texted me at 9:15 that morning, 3 words, no punctuation, the kind of message that carries more weight in its brevity than a full paragraph could. Still happening. Come. I read it 4 times before I finally opened the truck door. I found her in the bridal suite an hour later, already half into her mother's dress, her bridesmaids fussing with pins and clips around her, and when she saw me in the doorway, she waved everyone else out of the room for a minute, just the 2 of us, the way it had been, just the 2 of us for so much of the 4 years since Rosa died. I'm still angry, she said, straightening a fold of the dress in the mirror rather than looking directly at me. That's the most honest thing anybody said to me in 3 days, I told her. I'll take it. Did you and Mom really build all of that at our kitchen table, while I was doing homework 2 rooms away? Kayla laughed despite herself, a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from her since the rehearsal dinner. Most important things happen quieter than people expect, I said. That's basically the whole lesson of your mother's life, if you want the short version. The wedding happened that afternoon. I want to tell you it happened the way weddings are supposed to happen, full of joy and relief and clean resolution, but real life rarely organizes itself that neatly. It happened the way most difficult things happen, imperfectly, with visible cracks still showing, everyone present doing their best to hold a shape that had been genuinely fractured 2 nights earlier. Kayla walked down the aisle in her mother's dress, altered slightly to fit her, And when I saw her in it, walking toward a future I still had real reservations about, I felt the specific grief of watching your child make a choice you can't fully protect her from, only witness. Walter sat 2 rows over during the ceremony, unable to quite meet my eyes, Diane beside him looking like a woman doing complicated arithmetic in her head about seating charts and social consequences that no longer resolve the way they used to. Grant stood at the altar watching Kyla walk toward him with an expression I chose to interpret generously as genuine love complicated by genuine shame rather than performance. At the reception, held at the same Riverside Country Club ballroom where I detonated 11 years of quiet ownership 2 nights earlier, Walter approached me during the cocktail hour, alone, without his usual entourage of golf buddies and business associates trailing behind him for social cover. "I owe you an apology," he said, "not the kind I gave on the phone, a real one." "I'm listening," I said. "I built this company on my father's foundation, and I nearly destroyed it through my own arrogance. You and your wife saved it. Saved 200 jobs, including, frankly, my own, and I repaid that by treating you like something beneath consideration for 11 straight years because you didn't dress the part I decided people who mattered were supposed to dress. That's not a mistake I can undo with an apology at my son's wedding." I studied him for a long moment. 11 years of watching a man tells you how to read the difference between genuine reckoning and crisis management dressed up as humility. I still wasn't entirely sure which one I was looking at. "I appreciate you saying that, Walter," I said. "I mean that. But an apology doesn't erase 11 years of pattern, and it doesn't automatically earn back trust. What happens next? How you treat me going forward, how you treat the people on that plant floor who don't happen to own controlling equity." He nodded slowly, and for the first time in over a decade, I saw something in Walter Caldwell's face that looked less like the performed confidence of a man managing a room and more like an actual person confronting an actual failure. Diane found me a short while later, near the edge of the garden terrace where the club had set up a small bar away from the main reception noise. She was holding a glass of white wine she hadn't touched much, and she stood beside me for almost a full minute without speaking before she finally said, "Why do you think that was?" I asked, genuinely curious rather than accusatory. She considered the question longer than I expected. I told her I appreciated the honesty, and I meant it, Diane's apology. Unprompted and unwitnessed by anyone who might have pressured her into performing it, struck me as more genuine than almost anything Walter had said to me that night. We stood together at that terrace bar for a while longer, mostly quiet, watching the reception continue behind us through the tall windows, Kayla's laughter occasionally carrying out into the evening air in a way that eased something tight in my chest. Later that night, after most of the dancing had wound down and the older guests had started filtering toward the valet stand, Kayla found me sitting alone at a small table near the edge of the room, watching the last few couples sway to a slow song the band was using to signal the evening's close. She sat down across from me, still in Rose's dress, and for a while neither of us said anything. "I keep thinking about all the times growing up when you'd come home smelling like the plant, and I'd complain about it, and you'd just laugh and say it was the smell of a paycheck," she finally said. "I feel like an idiot for never once wondering why a maintenance supervisor's daughter never had to worry about money for college, or why you and Mom always seem so calm about big expenses other families stressed over." "You weren't supposed to wonder," I said. "That was the whole design, Kayla. Your mother and I wanted you to grow up like anybody else's kid. We didn't want you carrying the weight of what we'd built, good or bad, until you were old enough and settled enough to carry it the right way. Maybe we got the timing wrong. I think about that a lot, especially now. Do you regret it, keeping it from me?" I thought about that question honestly before I answered it, because she deserved an honest answer rather than a comforting one. She reached across the table and took my hand. "I love you too, sweetheart," I said. "More than any company, any equity stake, any amount of money your mother and I ever built quietly at that kitchen table. None of it means anything if it costs me you." Grant, for his part, found me later that evening near the edge of the dance floor. His tie loosened, his earlier anger apparently having burned itself out somewhere over the previous 2 days into something more uncertain. "I don't fully know what to say to you," he admitted, which was, I noted, the first entirely honest sentence he'd offered me since the whole thing began. "I spent 2 days furious at you, and somewhere in there I realized I was furious because you'd shown me something about myself I didn't want to see, not because you'd actually done anything wrong." "That's a more honest place to start from than most people get to in a week," I said. "Keep going from there, and you might actually turn into the man I hoped you'd become when Kayla first brought you home for dinner 2 years ago." "Do you think I can?" "I think that's entirely up to you," I said. "I can't make that decision for you any more than I can make Kayla's decision for her, but I'll tell you the same thing I told your father. What happens next is what matters. Not tonight, not the apology. What you do on an ordinary Tuesday 6 months from now, when there's no audience and nothing at stake and nobody's watching to see if you've actually changed, that's the test." I didn't get everything resolved that night, and I want to be honest about that rather than wrap this up falsely neat. Kayla and I are still rebuilding something that cracked open at that rehearsal dinner. Not broken, I don't think, but genuinely fractured in a way that takes real time and real consistency to mend. Not a single conversation or a single wedding toast. She asked me, a few weeks after the wedding, to take an active board seat at Caldwell Furniture Group, going forward, using her accounting background to help me actually oversee the equity stake Rosa and I built rather than let it sit anonymously in the background the way it had for over a decade. Word of what happened at the rehearsal dinner didn't stay contained to that ballroom for long. 200 guests, several of them with phones out by the end of the evening, meant that some version of the story was circulating around town within days, exaggerated in places, softened in others, the way stories always shift shape as they pass from mouth to mouth. By the time the wedding itself happened, I'd already had 3 separate people I barely knew stop me at the grocery store to ask, with varying degrees of tact, whether it was true that I secretly owned the furniture plant. Walter's father's old business partner, a retired lumber supplier named Curtis Boone, who'd known Harold since before either of them had gray hair, called me about a week after the wedding, his voice rough with age and, I think, genuine emotion. I thought about Curtis's call for a long time afterward, because it clarified something I hadn't quite articulated to myself yet. That in some strange way, what Rosa and I had built with Rosewood Capital wasn't really a departure from what Harold Caldwell had tried to build his whole life. It was almost a continuation of it. Walter himself brought Curtis's comment up to me a few weeks later, unprompted, during one of the increasingly regular conversations we'd started having about the plant's operations. Real conversations now, not the performed pleasantries of 11 years prior. "What do you think he meant by it?" I asked, curious how Walter himself would answer that question rather than deflect it. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee mug slowly on the conference table between us. I didn't correct him on that, because I thought he'd finally arrived at something true on his own, and I wasn't going to take that moment away from him by softening it into something more comfortable. The Monday after the wedding, I showed up for my regular shift at 7 a.m. My longtime co-worker Denny, who'd worked the line beside me for almost 20 years, cornered me by the break room coffee machine that first morning back, arms crossed, an expression somewhere between hurt and disbelief. "I didn't own it to make a point of owning it, Denny," I said. "I owned it because Rosa and I needed to save 200 jobs, including my own, including yours. If I'd walked around here for a decade acting like the boss, it would have changed everything about how this floor worked." Denny thought about that for a long moment, working it over the way he worked over a stubborn bolt, patient and methodical. "Probably both," I admitted, and he laughed, and something eased between us that I hadn't realized had tightened until it released. Not everyone on the floor took it that well, at least not immediately. Walter called a full board meeting 6 weeks after the wedding, the same timeline as the original disclosure filing that had forced my hand at the rehearsal dinner in the first place. I attended in person for the first time in 11 years, wearing my one good suit again, sitting at the same conference table where Walter had, according to the old board minutes I finally had full access to, once described operational efficiency in terms that never once accounted for the actual human beings executing that efficiency on the floor below his office window. I didn't use that meeting to punish anyone. I want to be clear about that, because I know some people hearing this story want a bigger, more dramatic reckoning. A boardroom coup, a public firing, some cinematic moment of total vindication. That's not what happened, and honestly, I don't think that's what Rosa would have wanted either. Walter agreed to all of it without argument, which told me more about where his head actually was than any apology could have. Grant agreed too, though I could see the resistance in his face even as he said the words, "Old habits, old assumptions, don't dissolve in 6 weeks no matter how humbling those 6 weeks have been." Walter has been different since the wedding as far as I can tell. Different in the small ways that actually matter, asking real questions on the floor instead of performing familiarity for an audience, restoring the holiday bonus for the overnight cleaning crew he'd cut years earlier, introducing me at company events now, when he introduces me at all, simply as Frank, a partner in this business, without the qualifying joke about grease and gears that used to follow automatically. Grant and Kayla are still married, still building whatever their life together is going to be. His first quarterly floor week, about 2 months after the wedding, was rougher than he expected. I could see that on his face by the second day, the particular exhaustion of a body unused to 8 hours of standing, lifting, moving with the deliberate care machinery demands of you. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," I told him, and he laughed, tired but genuine, and something between us shifted a fraction further in that moment than it had in the 2 years before it. By his third quarterly rotation months later, Denny told me Grant had actually started catching real problems on the floor before they escalated. A belt tension issue on line 4. Kayla, meanwhile, took her seat as Rosewood Capital's observer on the Caldwell Furniture Group board seriously from her very first meeting. She spent weeks beforehand reviewing 11 years of filings I'd quietly maintained, asking me questions late into the evening at my kitchen table. The same table, the same table, the same chairs, a new generation running the same patient conversations. It's not everything. It's not proof of some complete transformation, for Grant or for Walter or for Diane or for any of them. But it's more than I had any right to expect 2 days after that dinner, and I'm choosing, carefully and with my eyes open, to let that count for something while I keep watching for the pattern underneath it. Priscilla called me about a month after the wedding, having heard the story secondhand through the small circle of finance professionals who apparently still traded gossip about the ghost fund. It's not how I pictured it either, I admitted, but I think she was right about the rest of it. She'd be proud of you, Priscilla said, and I had to sit with the phone against my ear for a long moment after that, unable to answer right away, because hearing someone else say the words I most needed to hear carried a weight I hadn't braced myself for. Priscilla and I talked for almost another hour that day, longer than either of us had probably planned, drifting from business back into memory, the way conversations about Rosa always seemed to do with the people who'd actually known her work rather than just her warmth. I asked Priscilla near the end of that call whether she thought Rosa had always known it would come to something like this. A rehearsal dinner reveal, a wedding overshadowed, the whole complicated unraveling that followed. She laughed, not unkindly. That thought stayed with me for days afterward. The idea that Rosa hadn't just built a financial structure to protect us, but had somehow anticipated, with an accuracy that still unsettles me a little when I think about it too hard, the exact emotional shape of the moment that would eventually require it. About 4 months after the wedding, Walter asked me to speak at the plant's quarterly town hall, an all-staff meeting he'd started holding in the wake of everything that had happened, partly as damage control. I suspected at first, though it evolved into something more genuine over the following months. I'd never spoken in front of the full plant staff before, 200 and some employees packed into the break room and overflow hallway, people I'd worked alongside for decades who were now looking at me with an entirely new kind of attention. I kept it simple. I told them the same thing I'd told Denny by the coffee machine, that I hadn't hidden my ownership to deceive anyone, but to protect something more important than my own recognition. The honest, unguarded version of this workplace that only exists when people don't think ownership is standing in the room. I told them one more thing, the thing I hadn't fully said out loud to anyone besides Kayla and Priscilla up to that point, that Rosa Delgado, my late wife, a nurse who never finished college and never held a single official title at this company, was the actual architect of everything that had kept 200 families employed through the crisis year of 2015, and that if there was credit to be assigned for any of it, most of it belonged to a woman most of the people in that room had never even met. Denny, standing near the back, started clapping first. It spread through the room slowly, then all at once, and I stood there in my work coveralls, in front of the same machines I'd fixed for 31 years, and let myself feel, for the first time since Rosa's funeral, like something I'd carried alone for far too long had finally been set down and shared with people who understood its weight. I still wear the coveralls. I still fix the presses when a line goes down, still train new hires on safety protocols, still smell like machine oil most days of the week. I think about Rosa every time someone asks me that. About the quiet power she believed in, the kind that doesn't need an audience, doesn't need a title, doesn't need anyone's recognition to be real. There's a version of me I know that could have taken all of this differently, could have sold a stake years ago and moved somewhere warm, could have cashed out the moment the equity value climbed high enough to make the decision easy. I don't think that version of me would have been happier. I think he would have gotten the respect faster, sure, but it would have been a different kind of respect. The kind people extend automatically to money and title, regardless of character. The same reflexive deference Walter's golf buddies extended to him at that country club before they knew a single true thing about who actually held this company together. That's not respect. That's just recognition of leverage, and leverage without character behind it evaporates the moment circumstances change. I think about my nephew Matteo sometimes too, the boy who spilled grape juice on Grant's shirt all those years ago at my sister's backyard party. He's 14 now, still a little clumsy, still exactly the kind of kid who'd rather spend an afternoon taking apart an old radio than doing almost anything else. And I've started bringing him by the plant on weekends when his parents are willing to let him tag along, teaching him the same things Harold Caldwell taught me almost 40 years ago. I don't know if he'll grow up to run a company someday, or fix a machine instead of just looking at it. How to respect work that doesn't come with a corner office attached to it. I don't know if he'll grow up to run a company someday, or fix machines the way I have, or something else entirely. But I know I want him to grow up understanding that the value of a person was never supposed to be measured by the cut of their suit or the make of their truck. I visit Rosa's grave most Sunday mornings, a habit I picked up in the months right after the funeral and never broke. I went the Sunday after the wedding, sat on the grass beside her headstone the way I always do, and told her everything. We did it, I told her that morning, my hand resting flat against the cool granite the way it always does. I don't know what she'd say back if she could. Knowing Rosa, it would probably be something practical, something that cut straight through the sentiment to the next useful thing. Ask me whether the profit-sharing structure was properly indexed to revenue rather than net income, or whether Kayla's board seat came with adequate information rights, or whether I'd remembered to have Priscilla review the amended bylaws before the ink dried. I think that's the whole lesson of everything I've told you here, if there is one. Not the reveal at the dinner, satisfying as that moment was after 11 years of restraint. Not the apology or the wedding or any of the drama in between. The lesson is in the 11 years before any of that happened. The years of showing up, doing the work, holding the line quietly, trusting that a moment would eventually arrive where the truth mattered more than the comfort of staying hidden. If you're watching this and you've ever been the person in the room everyone assumes doesn't matter, the one in the wrong clothes, the wrong job, the wrong last name for the table you're sitting at, respect isn't something you can perform your way into faking forever. Eventually, it costs you something to fake it, and it costs you nothing at all to simply give it in the first place. If this story meant something to you, let me know where you're watching from.